It's almost like they thought that you becoming who you really are, that's really what Stoicism is. Of course, they believe that to be the virtuous good person, that we all fundamentally want to flourish. And by becoming you, by living according to nature, which includes that at all levels of analysis, including, objective reality and then human nature and community and then your individual personality. But then if you do that, in other words, if you become more yourself over time, at the same time, you're also servicing the world so that there's alignment here. And it's very, like, I like to think of it like harmony. It's like when you play a guitar, you have all these notes that kind of come
Hmm.
together and it
Yeah.
vibrates and it's beautiful. And that's really how I think that's what they meant by that. So it's interesting that sometimes we think about these things as separate. Like there's the individual and then there's the group. But I think there can actually be alignment between them, which allows all of us to flourish.
Yes, yes, and I like this because so much of I like your reading because so much of Stoicism is categorized as self-help, and it's important that it is because it is wonderful to see a philosophy being used practically and to have this real-world kind of efficacy in terms of how we can apply principles rather than just read about them in a book and relay them to someone else. I think that what you said at the start of your message there, though, was that whilst we can talk about the self and the prosperity for the self and learn these techniques through Stoicism, there's also a way in which we must recognize that the self is implicated in something beyond the self. And one of the, again, I'm going to keep using this word, but one of the most orthodox Stoic principles is to see oneself as a fragment of something bigger. You know, and I say they, and I don't mean to imply that every single ancient Stoic thinker was mentioning this, but to a degree, all of the surviving fragments indicate that the Stoics we're aware of shared this view, and that is that we are a fragment of something larger. We are a piece of a whole, and that's where you get that sense of the self as being very much jigsaw-like, bound into a bigger picture. And that, in my view, and I dare say in your view too, is relates to the systems analysis and the systems perspective that the Stoics have of each of us, which will then cast a new light on the whole idea of self-help applications of Stoicism if the self indeed is not this isolated entity.
Right, right, right. Yes, I love the analogy of a jigsaw.
Hmm.
That's interesting. That term though, self-help. If you think about that, that can mean a lot of different things. That can mean selfishly helping yourself, which of course is very unstoic. But I try and think about like how we relate these words to something like stoicism because it is a buzzword. People hear self-help. We have self it's like a category now of books, right? Self-help books.
Hmm.
But I think if again, I think if it is aligned properly, I think an act that does help yourself does help the world. And then you might ask, like, well, if you're going to help yourself and it's going to be selfish, are you really going to be happy about that? And that's where kind of sociology comes in. You know what I mean? Like if you do something selfishly, you might say gain money or something if you rip people off. But then it's like, can you really flourish? Can you really be happy? Can you live a happy life if you're doing that, kind of screwing the rest of the people around you, so to speak?
Mm. Yeah, I suppose for the Stoics, they would say that when we are thinking individually in terms of we're thinking. It's not anti-Stoic to think of individual prosperity, and
Right.
Epictetus is adamant about that, as is Marcus Aurelius. And so we don't want to lose sight of the priority they do give to this idea of the individual in terms of you need to be thinking of your own welfare. The irony of that, though, is that when you're thinking individually and when you're thinking of your own welfare, they will argue that you're thinking of the collective welfare as well.
Right.
If, and the key point here is that if, whenever you do anything, you are aware that you are an individual piece of a whole or a universal system. And that's the view from above. And it's not meant to be just a matter of the view from above serving my own humility and my own prosperity, but it's meant to be a default mechanism via which we know with everything we think and everything we do that we are serving something that is, in essence, our origin, which is the system itself. And as long as we're doing that, which seemingly also is the definition of thinking rationally, is to be
Right.
consciously and constantly aware of how embedded we are with everything else. As long as we're doing that, then we are going to experience this prosperity, and we're going to experience individual prosperity. And that prosperity will be linked to, a whole range of other aspects of Stoicism. They talk about happiness, eudaimonic happiness, all these kinds of things, which we can talk about. But to relate it then to sociology, um, my favorite areas of sociology are concerned with a set of theories that are categorized as structuralism. And structuralism will argue that everything you think, and this is going to be incredibly critiqued in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of this century. Uh, the structuralism will argue that everything you think is to some way always an expression of something else. And therefore, if we were to read this through the Stoics, we would say that happiness is to accept this reality about your mind. And in the first chapter of a book I've recently written, I argue that Epictetus is so adamant about our mind being a fragment of something else. He talks about the daemons, and Posidonius talks about this too, about our mind being this fragment which is in connection with the greater whole, and it's in connection with the greater whole through these things called daemons, which will connect our individual mind with the global or the universal mind. And prosperity is thinking in a way which is aware of this, and we can be selfish accordingly. We can think of ourselves, but we can think of ourselves and we can want to have individual prosperity whilst being conscious that our individual prosperity and our individual mind is an expression of this system of which we are a part. So you raise an important point there in that we can't just exclude the idea of individuality,
Right.
but we have to understand individuality either in sociology, according to my view, or in Stoic philosophy through this larger system.